I booked a lake house in late July, 2 summers ago. At the time, I was working 60-hour weeks, buried in projects with barely any time for myself. I was exhausted physically, mentally, everything. I needed a break, even if it was only for a weekend. I didn't want a city getaway or some touristy nonsense. I wanted isolation, quiet, a place where I could shut my phone off, listen to the sound of wind in the trees, and finally breathe. When I found the listing online, it seemed too good to be true, a small, rustic cabin right on the edge of a private lake. The photos showed a weathered dock stretching into dark water, a wide deck with 2 rocking chairs and nothing but dense forest surrounding it. The description claimed it was the perfect escape from modern life. It was 4 hours from my home, tucked away off a dirt road with no cell service in the area, but that only made it sound better. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, windows down, car heavy with groceries and a couple of books I'd been meaning to read. The further I got from the highway, the quieter the world became. No honking, no buzzing phones, no people. Just trees leaning over the narrow road, the occasional chirp of cicadas, and sunlight spilling through the branches. By the time I reached the cabin, I'd passed only 2 houses in the last 10 miles. The lake house stood alone, a little gray structure with peeling paint and a tin roof, as if it had been standing there untouched for decades. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even more isolated in person. The gravel driveway was empty and the place was dead silent. When I got out of the car, I stood for a moment, just listening. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. A faint breeze rippled the lake, and I could hear water lapping against the dock. For the first time in months, I felt some of the stress fall away. The first evening was everything I wanted. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat out on the back deck watching the sun sink behind the tree line. The lake turned gold, then black, and the forest swallowed the last of the light. By the time the crickets began their nighttime chorus, I was already stretched out in a rocking chair, half asleep. That was when I noticed him. Across the lake, just at the edge of the trees, a man was standing. He wasn't close enough for me to make out his face, but I could see the outline of his body clearly in the fading light. He stood perfectly still, like he'd been there for a while, watching. At first I thought he might be another guest staying at one of the other cabins nearby. The listing had said there were a few scattered around the lake, though I hadn't seen any on my drive-in. Maybe he was fishing or taking a walk. Still, the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me. He just stood there until it got too dark to see. I went inside, locked the doors, and told myself it was nothing. But later, lying in bed, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. A faint splashing. Slow, deliberate, like footsteps in shallow water. I sat up, heart thudding, and listened. The sound went on for a few minutes, then stopped. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined it, I heard the creak of the dock, like weight shifting on old wood. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my body didn't believe it. I barely slept that night, every creak of the cabin pulling me out of half-dreams. The next morning, I carried my coffee down to the dock to prove to myself it was nothing. That's when I saw them, wet footprints, human, bare feet. They led from the water up onto the dock, then stopped halfway, as if whoever made them had turned around and gone back into the lake. I froze, staring down at them. They were fresh, the wood was still damp. That was when I started to feel afraid. By afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself it didn't matter. Maybe a swimmer from one of the other cabins had wandered over and I hadn't noticed. Maybe kids had come by. There were explanations. But that evening, as I was cooking dinner, the doorbell rang. I didn't even know the place had a working doorbell. When I opened the door, he was standing there. The man from across the lake. Up close, he looked wrong. His clothes were soaked through, plastered to his skin, dripping onto the porch. His hair hung in wet clumps over his forehead, and his face was pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice flat. "I've been out here a long time. I'm trying to find a way back." Every instinct in me screamed to shut the door, but instead I nodded stiffly. Yeah, I can call someone for you." "No," he said quickly. His lips twisted into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. "You should come with me?" Just for a minute, I felt my stomach drop. "Sorry, I can't," I muttered and closed the door. When I looked again a few seconds later, he was gone. Not walking down the drive, not anywhere, just gone. That night I'd barely slept at all. I locked every window, shoved a chair under the doorknob, and sat up listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the creak again, the sound of the sliding glass door on the deck. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept into the living room. The door was wide open, curtains blowing in the night breeze. My chest seized when I saw it. I knew I had locked it. Just as I went to close it, movement caught my eye. Out on the lake, knee-deep in the water, the man stood staring at the house. His clothes clung to him, dripping. His head was tilted slightly like a predator watching prey. I slammed the door shut, locked it, pulled the curtains, and spent the rest of the night in the bedroom corner gripping the poker until my arms ached. When morning finally came, I didn't pack neatly. I threw everything in my bag, shoved it into the car, and floored it down the dirt road without even checking the mirrors. On the drive home, I called the rental owner to tell him what had happened. His response chilled me almost as much as the man had. "People talk about seeing things out there sometimes," he said, his tone casual, almost bored. "It's nothing to worry about. Happens all the time. Happens all the time." I don't know who or what that man was. I don't know how he got inside the cabin or why he wanted me to come with him. I just know that when I left, he was still standing in that lake, watching. And sometimes, when I wake up at night to the sound of faint splashing in my head, I wonder if he's still there, waiting for me to come back. I'm 31 now, but this happened when I was 27. Back in the fall of 2019, I live in southern Pennsylvania, just close enough to the Appalachian Range that the mountains feel like part of my backyard. I've been into backpacking and camping since high school, nothing extreme, but enough that I've picked up the skills you need to go off trail. I can read a compass, pitch camp in rough ground, and keep myself alive if I run into bad weather or a black bear. I'd never call myself a survivalist, but I was comfortable in the woods. Normally I never went alone. I had 2 close friends who loved the same thing, and we had a tradition of taking at least one serious trip every fall. Usually it was 2 or 3 nights on some rugged trail, the kind where you have to filter creek water and ration out your food. It was our reset button. But that year, 2019, everything fell apart. One of my friends had just become a dad and the other got slammed with overtime at work. Both bailed. I'd already taken the week off and had my pack ready. I told myself, screw it, I'll just go solo. I picked a route I'd heard about from a guy at a local gear shop. It wasn't a marked trail more, like an old logging road that had long since been reclaimed by the forest. It cut through a valley known locally as Deer Hollow, between 2 ridges. According to the topo maps, there was a small creek running through the hollow, with some flat areas that would make good campsites. My plan was to hike in 2 days, camp at the far end near a bend in the creek, spend a day exploring, then head back out the way I came. 4 days total. I started on a Monday morning. The weather was perfect, crisp air, the kind that smells like pine needles and damp earth. Fall colors painted the trees, reds and yellows, so vivid it almost looked fake. My boots crunched over leaves as I followed the barely visible trailhead into the woods. Within an hour, I couldn't hear the highway anymore. Just birds, the occasional squirrel, and the steady rhythm of my footsteps. That first day felt almost euphoric. There's something about being alone in the woods. You feel small, but free. I stopped a couple times to drink from my water bladder and check my compass against landmarks. A rocky outcropping to the east. A split oak tree leaning over the creek. The hollow was beautiful, wide enough that the ridges rose like walls on either side. By late afternoon, I found a clearing just above the creek and set up camp. I pitched my little green tent, gathered some deadfall, and had a small fire going by dusk. I boiled water for ramen, ate, and sat watching the flames as night closed in. That's when I heard it, a snap. Sharp and deliberate, like a thick branch breaking under weight. My head jerked up. The sound had come from behind my tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees. My first thought was deer. The place was called Deer Hollow for a reason, but the sound didn't fit. Deer are clumsy, they crash through brush, snort, stomp. This had been one clean break, then silence. I waited, ears straining. The fire popped, the creek gurgled, but nothing else. Probably just a limb falling, I muttered, though my gut said otherwise. After 10 minutes with no repeat, I put the fire out and crawled into my tent. I unzipped my sleeping bag, flicked on a small headlamp, and tried to read a paperback I'd brought. But I kept stopping to listen. Every little creak of the forest set my nerves on edge. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted off. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Crunch, crunch, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. My whole body went rigid. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps would move, pause, then move again, always around me. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk in slow circles. I reached for the hunting knife I kept near my bag and gripped it tight. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the nylon walls. I wanted to yell, say, "Hey," or make noise to scare it off, but something in me froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. After what felt like forever, the steps faded into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle stiff, clutching the knife. When morning light finally filtered through the tent, I unzipped the flap and stumbled out. That's when I saw them. Boot prints, human. They circled my tent in the dirt and leaves, faint but unmistakable. I should have left right then, but I told myself it had to be a hunter passing through. People did that around here. Maybe he'd seen my fire, gotten curious, and walked past in the night. Creepy, sure, but explainable. I packed up and pushed on. The second day's hike was harder, steeper ground, more boulders and fallen logs to climb over. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on my compass bearings. But every so often I swore I heard something behind me. A branch snapping, a faint crunch of leaves. Always too far to see when I turned around. By late afternoon I reached the far end of the hollow. The creek widened into a shallow pool, with a small flat clearing beside it. Perfect campsite. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, and got a fire going. For a while, it almost felt normal. The light on the water was beautiful, the air cool and crisp. I ate dinner, stoked the fire, and leaned back against the log, trying to enjoy the peace. But as darkness fell, the feeling came back. That I wasn't alone. This time it wasn't just a feeling. Across the creek, maybe 30 yards away, a figure stood between the trees, a man. Motionless, just watching. My stomach dropped. "Hey," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it across the creek. For a split second, the beam caught him. He was tall, wearing a hooded jacket, his face shadowed, and then he stepped back, vanishing into the trees. Adrenaline surged. I threw more wood on the fire, heart hammering. I sat there gripping my knife, eyes scanning the darkness. Every flicker of shadow made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke with a start to the sound of fabric. A soft rustle right behind me. I spun around. The flap of my tent was open. My blood ran cold. I lunged forward with the flashlight, sweeping the beam inside. My sleeping bag was still there. My backpack too, nothing obviously missing, but the zipper hung open, swaying slightly. Someone had been in my tent while I sat 10 feet away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I fed the fire until dawn, every nerve screaming. At first light, I shoved everything into my pack and started hiking back. I moved fast, pushing hard to cover both days' distance in one. My legs burned, sweat stung my eyes, but I didn't care. I just wanted out, but it wasn't over. Several times on the way back, I found things out of place. A granola bar wrapper on the ground that wasn't mine. A piece of cord lying across the trail, same type 1 used for my tent guy lines. Once, when I stopped to filter water, I swear I heard a low laugh. Carried on the breeze, gone before I could be sure. By late evening, I stumbled back into the trailhead parking lot. My car was still there. I threw my pack in, locked the doors, and sat shaking behind the wheel. Later, at home, I realized my pack felt lighter. I went through it carefully. A couple food items were gone, my multi-tool, a small flashlight. Nothing huge, but enough to prove I hadn't imagined it. Someone had taken things while I slept. Even now, years later, I don't know what their deal was. A drifter living off-trail? Some hermit who enjoyed messing with hikers? Or someone darker with intentions I don't want to think about? All I know is this: I've never backpacked solo again. And sometimes when I lie awake at night, I can still hear the sound of those footsteps circling my tent in the dark. When I was 27, I made the decision to move back into my childhood home after my mother passed away. She had been a single parent, and as her only child, the house and the land it sat on were left to me. I hadn't been back there for years. At the time, I was living in a cramped, moldy apartment on the far side of town, and between rent and bills, I could barely keep my head above water. The house was old but fully paid off, and I told myself it was only temporary. My plan was to live there for a while, save some money, and eventually sell the property so I could afford a home somewhere closer to the city. The house itself was strange compared to the newer neighborhoods I was used to. It was an old barn-style farmhouse, isolated in the middle of several acres of overgrown farmland. My mom used to keep a garden when I was younger, but by then the land had gone wild, just tall grass and weeds stretching in every direction, with a thin dirt path leading to the main road. There weren't any close neighbors. The few other properties in the area had also fallen into disuse, and when I first drove up, I realized just how secluded the place really was. At first, the isolation felt refreshing. The air smelled cleaner, and at night I could see stars instead of streetlights. My first week was uneventful. I spent most of my time cleaning out rooms, unpacking boxes, and rediscovering old family photos I hadn't seen in years. There was something bittersweet about being there, memories of my childhood mixed with the constant reminder that my mother wasn't around anymore. It was during one of those nights, while I was scrubbing down the kitchen counters, that I heard the low rumble of an engine. I frowned, wiped my hands, and peered out the front window. An old pickup truck was slowly making its way down the overgrown dirt path toward the house. I froze. Out here, there wasn't any reason for someone to drive up unless they were coming to the property deliberately. The truck rolled forward until it was maybe 50 feet from the house. The headlights cut across the field, illuminating the tall grass in stark white. Through the windshield, I could make out the shadow of a man sitting in the driver's seat, but not enough detail to see his face. He didn't honk, he didn't wave. He just sat there for maybe a minute, engine idling, headlights flooding the property. Then, without warning, he turned the wheel, did a slow 3-point turn, and drove back down the path. At the time, I convinced myself it must have been a wrong address. Maybe he'd been looking for a friend's house and realized he'd taken the wrong turn. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't unsettle me. Over the next few days, I kept busy. I had electricity, but the internet hadn't been hooked up yet, so most of my evenings were spent cooking, reading, or watching DVDs on an old player I found in the attic. By Sunday, I was actually beginning to enjoy the quiet. That night, after dinner, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and watched a movie. Sometime around 1 in the morning, I heard it again, the faint rumble of tires crunching gravel. My stomach dropped. I turned off the TV and hurried to the window. There it was, the same pickup truck, slowly rolling down the path toward the house. But this time, the headlights were off. I stood there in the dark, heart hammering in my chest, as the vehicle approached and stopped right in front of the house. The door creaked open, a man stepped out. The porch light was off, but the moon was bright enough for me to see his outline. He walked up the path, his boots crunching on the gravel, until he was standing on my porch. I waited for a knock or the ring of the doorbell, but it never came. Instead, he just stood there. I crept closer to the door and pressed my eye against the peephole. My blood ran cold. The man was staring directly at the door, his face only inches from the peephole, as if he knew I was there, watching. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, breathing heavily, for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he turned around, walked back to his truck, and drove off. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office. They listened politely, said it might have been a trespasser or a drunk, and told me to call again if he came back. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I knew this wasn't some random drunk. 2 nights later, around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound, a single, heavy knock. I bolted upright in bed, ears straining. The knock didn't come again. Slowly, I got out of bed and went to the window, expecting to see the truck in the driveway, but the yard was empty. Confused, I grabbed my phone and tiptoed out into the hallway. As I reached the top of the staircase, my heart nearly stopped. The front door was open, just slightly, and then I heard them footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the wooden floorboards downstairs. I darted into the spare bedroom and locked the door. My hands shook as I dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher, explaining what was happening, but I could barely get the words out. The footsteps moved through the living room, then into the kitchen, then up the stairs. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to silence my breathing. The intruder's boots creaked on each step, closer and closer until they reached the landing. He didn't come to the spare room. He went straight into the master bedroom, my room. I heard drawers sliding open, objects being moved around, the faint sound of him rummaging through my belongings. I sat frozen, paralyzed by fear. He knew I was home. He had to, so why wasn't he coming for me? What was he looking for? After what felt like forever, his footsteps returned down the stairs. The front door creaked open, then shut. Silence. When the officers arrived 20 minutes later, the man was gone. They searched the property, but found nothing. I gave them every detail I could remember, his height, his build, his old truck. But with no plates and no clear description of his face, there wasn't much they could do. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the locked spare room until sunrise, jumping at every sound. Over the following week, I tried to piece together what was happening. Why had he been there twice before? Why did he seem to know the house so well? The thought that haunted me most was that he might have known my mom. Maybe he'd been here before, maybe even while I was a kid. The next time I saw him, it was different. I woke up to silence, not the sound of knocking or footsteps, but an oppressive silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I sat up in bed and realized something was wrong. The back door, the one that led out to the field, was open. I hadn't opened it. When I crept downstairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen table, in the center of the wood, was a small, folded piece of paper. I picked it up with trembling hands. Inside, in jagged handwriting, were 4 words: "You shouldn't be here." That was it. No explanation, no signature. I left the house that morning and never spent another night there. Within a month, I sold the property to a developer who planned to demolish it. I never went back, not even to collect some of my mother's old things. Even now, years later, I still wonder what that man was searching for. Something my mom had hidden? Something left behind in the house? Or was it me he wanted all along, and I just happened to move in too soon, ruining whatever plans he had? I'll never know. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the faint rumble of an old pickup truck outside my window.